So 2022 certainly has been a year, and movies definitely did come out. Back in June, I began a journey of logging every film that I watched over the year and placed them into a list that I periodically tweaked and adjusted to try and keep as accurate as possible. Now, I didn't necessarily watch as many movies as I'd have liked to over the last 12 months, but by the time of this video going up, I ended up with 48 movies on the list to go through. I based my thoughts of the films on both my subjective enjoyment of the thing and a more objective quality of filmmaking. There are, however, a couple things I want to get out of the way before we fully get into it. 1. Since there's an element of subjectivity here, there's likely to be some hot takes and unpopular opinions, so bear in mind that this is my list, but I would love to hear from anybody that wants to share their thoughts in the comments below. 2. Some of these films might appear online as 2021 releases, however those would be screenings at film festivals, with their true theatrical releases coming sometime this year. And 3 is that I will be spoiling every film in this list to varying degrees. I will throw the films up on screen before I start talking about them, so if a movie pops up that you want to avoid spoilers for, feel free to use the timestamps in the description to jump around the video. Now, without any further ado, my name is Connor, and here is every movie that I saw released in 2022, ranked from worst to best. Let's go! Dashcam is bad. Like, really bad. Not only is it far and away my least favourite film of the year, but also possibly my least favourite film of all time. I don't really think of myself as a particularly harsh critic. I can usually find a few things that I like in movies that I don't, but Dashcam is such a monumental failure that I genuinely can't say a nice thing about it. So the film is a found footage horror about a live streamer called Annie who is just the worst person. You know all those anti-vaxxer tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists that think COVID is a hoax intended to control the general public? Well, Annie is every cliche and stereotype you'd associate with those people, and you add in some extremist right-wing political views and a dash of narcissism. She just sucks. Anyway, she gets sick of the man holding her down and telling her what to do during the pandemic, so she goes to the UK where those exact same rules apply, but she obviously didn't think of that, to visit her friend Stretch. Now, if you don't believe me that this character is the absolute worst, she sneaks into her friend's house in the middle of the night, spits into her hand and slaps him across the face to wake him up. Because he doesn't welcome her with open arms, the doy, she steals his car and eventually picks up a strange elderly woman, and things go to shit. Unfortunately, from this point onwards, there doesn't seem to be any plot. The film just leapfrogs from set piece to set piece without any real direction or forward momentum. It's incredibly difficult to understand what's happening half the time with how shaky the camera work is, and I know that found footage films are always kind of like this, but this is the next extreme. At its best, it's a horror movie that's not scary because you can't tell what's happening, and at worst, it'll give you motion sickness or a possible seizure. There's no resolution as to what's happening plot-wise, no character has an arc, and as far as I could tell, there was no theme or message to the story. It superficially references political issues like Trump's time in office, and obviously the coronavirus, but just doesn't do anything with it. It's literally there for the name drop, and that's it. There's seemingly no planning or structure to this script. It's like the kind of scary story you would have written when you were 10, just going, and then this happened, and then this happened. The footage we're watching isn't even from a dashcam. That's how shit this movie is. I honestly can't think of a positive thing to say about it. The closest thing to a compliment I can give it is that it's only an hour and 10 minutes long. But the crazy thing is, it still drags on way too long. I wanted to check out really badly after the 30-minute mark, but I kept watching purely hoping that Annie would die. The funny thing is, in most found footage horror movies, the protagonist does die, hence why we find the footage. But Dashcam couldn't even give us that. Annie makes it through to the end, doesn't learn anything, and sends us off by wrapping the credits while driving. I hate it, make it go away. I'll admit, I never expected this movie to land here. It wasn't even that long ago that I saw those promotional shots of Ana de Armas in character as Marilyn, and I thought, hey, that should be pretty good. How very wrong I was. Blonde was absolutely miserable to watch. The film is just under 3 hours long and honestly is just a distasteful dramatization of Marilyn Monroe's most painful and regrettable moments in and out of the public eye. We unfortunately have to endure a sexual assault literally within 10 minutes of Anna appearing on screen, and the tone never really picks up again afterwards. We have to just sit there and watch as she's almost killed as a child by her mentally ill mother, left in an orphanage, get emotionally manipulated, domestically abused, blackmailed, forced to substance abuse, and has multiple abortions, one of which was not voluntary. In a strangely pro-choice directorial decision, we even have to witness the unborn child in CGI form slowly die. There are no moments of reprieve at all, it's 3 hours of misery. I think that it's trying to be a critique of exploitation and the trends that usually surround it, but ironically, it kind of ends up contributing to that very thing. The whole thing felt exploitative beyond compare. Don't get me wrong, Marilyn was one of the most iconic sex symbols of the 20th century, so any attempt at telling her story will feature her sexualization and depict the way that she was manipulated through her life. But the way that Blonde handles these themes just feels in poor taste to me. There's so much unnecessary nudity that it just felt gratuitous. I'm sure that some people will jump to its defense by saying that it's not a biopic and that it's based on a book from the early noughties, but to me, it just doesn't really matter. The filmmakers can use that as an excuse all they like, but it still resulted in a film that should just not exist for so many reasons. There are some beautiful shots in here, especially towards the beginning, that demonstrate a clearly experienced cinematographer, but then there's also some rather questionable moments. There are some proper nauseating head tracking shots, and the colour scheme and aspect ratio seem to alter all the time at random. I assumed that there was a point that it jumped from black and white to colour and 4:3 to widescreen. Maybe the colour shots are Marilyn's happy moments, or the black and white symbolises her iconic moments, but as much as I tried, I couldn't work it out. It just seemed style over substance. Ana de Armas is great in the role, and this is absolutely not her fault. She gave it everything she had, and I think she looks amazing as Marilyn with the hair and everything, but I think that Joyce Carol Oates' source material and Andrew Dominik's direction just made this an awful thing that unfortunately exists in our world now. Well, this just had very little going for it, in all honesty. Netflix's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, not to be confused with 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or 2003's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is the 9th entry in the series and the 4th reboot of the timeline. Now, you'd think that with an incredibly historically significant and iconic horror series like this, that this 2022 requel would have lots of respect for the legacy of the franchise. But oh boy, this is only really a Texas Chainsaw movie in the fact that there's a chainsaw and it's in Texas. Sally Hardesty returns from the original movie, but is pretty much a knockoff of Laurie Strode's character from Halloween 2018, who herself was just a wannabe Sarah Connor. They go for the whole, I was so traumatized by the events of the original film that I trained myself into becoming a badass and have waited decades to kill you thing. There's nothing original or even interesting about what they did to her character. At all. She's not the only one either. Leatherface himself is nothing like his 1974 counterpart. If you remember in the original, Leatherface was always the lackey of the family. He was pushed around by his siblings and acted sort of like a wounded animal when cornered. From his perspective, his home was being invaded by a group of teenagers, and he was just doing as he was told and defending the house. Whoever wrote this thing clearly didn't get that message. The rest of the Sawyer family is completely absent. They were just as much a part of the horror of that first film, because it seemed like everybody in town was in on it. In the 2022 version, Leatherface is more of a Jason Voorhees type of character. He silently stalks his victims and has a seemingly supernatural aspect to him. It seems that he can teleport around when the plot needs it, he just won't die, and has superhuman strength. At one point, he completely snaps somebody's wrists in half with his bare hands, and uses the protruding bones to stab the guy to death. Please remember that this is set 48 years after the original film, so Leatherface is somewhere in his 70s or 80s at this point, but he has the strength to do that. The people in this movie seem to be completely capable of recovering from the most insane bodily harm. There's a scene towards the end where two characters seem to be fine despite a few hours prior. One was impaled through the thigh with a steel rod, and the other was hit in the ankle by an airborne chainsaw. Sally gets completely penetrated in the torso by the chainsaw and lifted up into the air, organs flying everywhere, yet 10 minutes later she's somehow still alive. The people that we're supposed to care about are essentially two-dimensional meatbags for Leatherface to kill. They're pretty much all unlikable, who speak in cringy Gen Z quips and make stupid decisions that obviously end up in them dying. One character is made out to be the survivor of a school shooting and has a disdain for firearms. This could be a really cool thing to explore, but by the end she overcomes her aversion and uses a shotgun. Is that the message? Is that what this film wants to get across? The personal journey that this character went on was to learn to be okay with guns? This is higher than the previous two films because, as bad as it is, it didn't actively upset me when watching it. But bad CGI gore and an overall lack of any scary scenes make for a film with nothing worthwhile to warrant your time. After the disappointing mess that was last year's Halloween Kills, I was expecting this one to be bad. However, I was not expecting it to be quite that bad. Don't get me wrong, I love a slow burn horror flick, but this was just boring. Nothing happened here for the first 60 minutes, and by the time it gets going and decides to do something, it's not even all that compelling. Halloween Kills had its issues like repetitive dialogue, dumb characters, and an overly capable Michael Myers, but during those scenes where he does his thing, it was pretty great. He was very intimidating and ruthlessly brutal in the way he killed the residents of Haddonfield. As for Halloween Ends, I've never been any less scared of the Shape. I mean, to be honest, he's barely in the movie, but when he is, it removes any element of fear or intimidation that the character had left. This once unstoppable killing machine is now just an old man getting his ass kicked by a dorky teenager. Unfortunately, it just doesn't follow up from the previous two movies all that well. Despite the issues I had with Halloween Kills, at least it continued the story of the prior films in a consistent way. In this one, none of the characters are consistent with the way they were characterized before. Like, are we really supposed to believe that Laurie Strode became a survivalist obsessed with killing Michael for 40 years after the events of the original movie, where a few of her friends died, but has somehow mellowed over the last 4 years despite her lifelong nightmare coming back and killing half of the town, including her daughter? I don't buy it. All the other characters are just hard to watch because of how unlikable they are. Every resident of Haddonfield, with the exception of about 3 people, are all jarringly hostile towards each other for no real reason or motive. You have the cliché Stephen King-esque bullies, the confrontational radio presenter, the creepy guy at the diner, the homeless man, Corey's mum, and even some random woman at the local shop just being assholes. With the population acting this bizarrely, I struggle to understand why Laurie and Allison don't simply move away and live somewhere else. They have no reason to stay, no friends or family, just bad memories. The message is a little confusing too, because in one scene Michael grabs Corey and could easily kill him, but doesn't. It's implied that he looked into his eyes and saw the same evil that drives him, so he lets him go. But later on, the message seems to be, look what people are capable of when society drives them to extremes. So was Corey inherently evil, or did people make him that way? It's like the film itself can't really decide. I will say though, the opening titles are pretty cool, with the classic pumpkins rotting away to reveal different pumpkins inside, and the use of Don't Fear the Reaper in the credits was a nice callback to the original film from '78. I appreciated that they tried to do something different with this one and not rehash the same formula that we've had for 4 decades, but the final installment of the series was not the time to take a dramatic left turn like this. Halloween Ends was an overly long, reference-filled slog that didn't manage to deliver the satisfying ending that I feel we deserved. It's honestly upsetting to see this icon of a series go out on such a whimper. I bet you didn't expect this to be this high. Well, after all the memes and negative press that came out of Morbius, I was at least expecting one of those so bad it's good kind of movies, you know, like a Samurai Cop or Troll 2, but this absolute mess of a film couldn't even accomplish that. Pretty much every aspect of this thing sucks, from the screenwriting, to the editing, to the direction, to the CGI. It's all bad, without even being fun. So, Michael Morbius is a doctor with a rare blood disorder that tries to cure his illness by using bat DNA, but in the end turns into a lame-ass vampire. It's hard to take a concept this silly seriously anyway, but when you hear about Jared Leto's behind-the-scenes antics, it just sucks all joy out of the room. In case you didn't hear, Jared insisted on walking around the set with his crutches because he's so method, which slowed down production so significantly that the crew gave him a wheelchair in the end because it took him half an hour to take a shit. He obviously didn't learn any lesson from the whole Suicide Squad thing. Jared, if you're going to make everybody's life miserable for the sake of a movie, then at least make it a good movie. You think people would have put up with Kubrick's behaviour on The Shining if he wasn't one of the greatest directors of all time? No. Morbius was just a boring movie that ended just when things started to feel like they were moving. In the end, I wasn't entertained, I just had questions. Why does Milo have two names when it never comes into play or affects the plot? Why does injecting himself with bat DNA give him abs? How did Milo administer the serum to himself when Michael had to have it slowly injected into his spine? Why does Michael abandon his principles in the end for no apparent reason? What happened to the second vial of poison? Why did they cut the punchline to the I am Venom joke that was in the trailer, because now it doesn't make any sense? Why does having bat DNA in his system let him mind control bats? Why do we keep casting Jared Leto in comic book movies? And finally, are we really going to try and tie this into the MCU? It's just a nothing movie where nothing happened until the credits rolled, and then it has the gall to sequel bait. The only real redeemable aspect is that it's fun to watch Matt Smith enjoy himself in a silly role. I spent the entire movie wishing that he was the main character instead, because at least then it would have been entertainingly bad. But hey, maybe we can make Sony release it in cinemas a third time for the memes. Whoever wrote the line, "Liar, liar, pants on fire," must have thought it was so metal. But hey, I like Stephen King. I really do. It's just such a shame that most adaptations of his work very rarely hit the mark, and in the case of Firestarter, this is the second time that they failed. A lot of people don't know this, but this movie was already released in the early 80s with a very young Drew Barrymore, and even that one's not great, but this one is significantly worse. If that wasn't bad enough, I nearly had an existential crisis when I found out that Zac Efron is now old enough to play the father to an 11-year-old girl. The man is 35 now, and that just doesn't sit right with me. I think the biggest complaint I have with the thing is just a prolonged sense of boredom and disbelief. Even though he is old enough, I just never bought the father-daughter dynamic between Andy and Charlie, which made it a little difficult for me to immerse myself into the story. The runtime was a little weird too, because in a rather conflicting fashion, I found the story could have really benefited from being at least 2 hours in order to fully flesh everything out, but then I'm also glad that this poor retelling of Stephen King's story didn't drag its heels on any longer than 90 minutes. I'm not entirely sure whose idea it was to remake this film, of all the 80s horror classics to choose from, but the whole production just reeks of a crew that didn't really care about this story. The relationship between Andy and Charlie should have been the absolute focus of the movie, exploring the tense and delicate balance of loving confidant and protective guardian. You know Andy wants Charlie to be happy and have a normal childhood, but he also has to remind her of the dangerous life she leads due to something that was ultimately out of her control. Unfortunately, the film doesn't delve anywhere near deep enough into this aspect of the story, which results in a set of characters that I have absolutely no emotional attachment to. Now, as you'd expect from an overtly powerful child, Charlie isn't exactly mature enough to emotionally control her abilities yet. This is obviously going to be one of the main focuses of the narrative, but the short runtime doesn't allow us to build much of a connection with her before she inevitably breaks, or to become invested enough to follow her regardless of her decisions. This choice on the film's behalf makes her character feel more unlikable than inherently sympathetic. There are a couple of issues I have that lie more with the original story than this specific adaptation, like the typical Stephen King bullies that are obnoxiously cruel for no real reason, never getting reprimanded by the teachers standing literally feet away, and the painfully contrived decisions made by the characters that serve the plot more than it does them as people. No one acts like they would in reality. You can literally feel the script desperately trying to get these people from A to B so that the story can happen. Yet, despite these issues, it's far from the worst thing I've ever seen. John Carpenter's score is pretty great, and the film doesn't overstay its welcome. Its short runtime is a detriment to its ultimate goal of telling a compelling story, but it actually works as an overall strength to the finished product. It kills an hour and a half, and remains an inoffensive, if ultimately directionless and passionless project. It's pretty bad, but I didn't want to have a shower afterwards. Do what you want with that information. Did somebody say another low-budget Netflix offering that was pumped out to boost their numbers for 2022? Because ultimately that's what Choose or Die is. The film is about a student that comes across an obscure retro video game from the 80s called Cursor, great name I know, that has an unclaimed prize of $100,000 for completing it. So she starts to play it and the game comes to life. Bet you didn't see that coming. The plot is pretty shallow and not fleshed out all that much, and the characters are pretty dull in writing and intelligence. Like, they're objectively pretty smart, you know, they're computer nerds, but when it comes to making decisions in a life or death scenario, they make the absolute worst choices. And this is going to seem like a random nitpick, but the game is never as brutal again for the rest of the movie as it is in the cold open. At the beginning, this guy has to choose between his son's tongue or his wife's ears, and after choosing, he goes upstairs to find that the son's tongue has been cut out. That's pretty grim, but everything afterwards is just fast forward or rewind, and clean up mess or break another glass. It always finds a way to turn horror-esque, but it's a tad underwhelming when the game's brutality peaks in the first 5 minutes. Unfortunately, Choose or Die is a horror movie that just isn't that scary. It isn't as if the premise is all that original either. It's a game turned real life like Jumanji and Zathura that borrows its style from 2018's Truth or Dare. In fact, the ending of this film is kind of exactly the same as that one. There's not much going on here to fully appreciate. What saves it from being down with films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the synth-pop soundtrack, the 84-minute runtime, and the fact that I don't hate every character in here. It's worth watching just for the last 15 minutes where Eddie Marsan hams it up big time. It's the most entertaining part of the movie for sure.
Fuck the 80s. Fuck the 80s!
You know, it's such a shame the trajectory this series has gone in. I actually would defend the first Despicable Me as a decently entertaining children's movie with likeable characters and a warm message. But over the years, and as the series has continued to expand, Illuminations have clearly been trying to milk the Minion bandwagon for all it's worth, and we eventually end up with this movie. I've heard people say it's better than the first Minions film, which I haven't seen, but if that's true, oh god. There's not really much to say about this one. It's not a particularly great film, its story is pretty uninspired, and the humour is typical for a young kid's animated flick. There are a lot of fart jokes and over-the-top slapstick that will probably have your infant children rolling on the floor with laughter, but anyone over the age of 10 will likely find it annoying. Like, there is so much minion ass in this movie, that was my main takeaway after leaving the cinema. It's pretty frustrating because Disney, Pixar, and even DreamWorks have proven time and time again that you can make a kids film and still have it treat the audience with respect. When I watch Shrek or The Incredibles, I don't get the impression that the creators think that I'm an idiot, but that's exactly what I get here. Gru is fine, I guess, as a protagonist, but he's pretty much the same person he was at the start of the first Despicable Me, but with a squeakier voice. The minions are as irritating as ever, and at one point even do the big eye Puss in Boots face from Shrek. That rubbed me the wrong way. I know people will say that I'm overthinking this and that it's a kids film, so I should just turn my brain off and have fun, but that argument has always rubbed me the wrong way. I like those films that you can switch off and enjoy without paying 100% attention, but a film should still be made to a certain quality that you can watch it properly. If you're the kind of person that says, well, it's a film for kids, then you're a part of the problem. Despite these problems, the film will probably hold your attention for the runtime, you just might find yourself rolling your eyes on occasions. There were actually two things that I honestly liked in this movie, one being the name of the vinyl store hiding the villain's lair is called Criminal Records. That's fun, and the Bond opening titles parody was genuinely unexpected and quite funny. I watched this with my girlfriend, and we both looked at each other during this sequence and laughed our heads off. I suppose how much you enjoy this movie comes down to your thoughts on the minions themselves. If you think they're cute or funny, you'll probably have a decent time. If you think they're the annoying spawn of Satan, then you may find yourself clock-watching like I was. Here's the thing, right? Video games infamously don't do a very good job of adapting to the silver screen, which is why I was honestly surprised by how the first Sonic movie was better than it had any right to be. Other than the use of Sonic, Robotnik, and rings as a plot device, it didn't really have much to do with the source material at all, albeit to the film's benefit. I was worried that it was going to be a reference-filled slog that couldn't keep focused on the story it was trying to tell. Luckily, that wasn't the case. But that's kind of exactly what the sequel is. To my absolute shock, I've seen a lot of people saying that this is better than the first one. Now, I'm not going to pretend that the original was actually a great movie or anything, but I think it was far more tight and enjoyable than this one. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 features far more fan service to the game series, but it seems to struggle maintaining focus on its own premise. There are plenty of nods to the series' roots which are welcome, like Sonic using the bubble to breathe underwater, the water shoots, Supersonic, and my favourite, the coffee shop called Mean Bean. But the actual plot of the movie is so dime a dozen and scatterbrained that it's hard to really get invested. It's nice to see Sonic, Tails and Knuckles together on screen, and Jim Carrey is giving it his all as always, but I still found it difficult to enjoy the thing. It falls into the trap of being too much like a kids movie with some pretty shit humour. There's a sassy black woman that's in this for some reason, and her whole deal is not funny, it just derails the movie for 20 minutes. Unfortunately, James Marsden is barely in this one, so the relationship that Sonic and Tom developed in the first film was barely explored here, which seemed like a waste of potential to me. Pair all that with a runtime that drags on for a little too long, and I think you end up with a movie that you just can't really wait to be over. What was the point of this? I mean, seriously, The Grey Man is 130 minutes of every action movie trope, cliche, and stereotype mashed into an overly long, predictable paste. The whole world's best mercenary going rogue and on the run thing was overdone back in the early 90s. We need to stop doing this. I'm sure that plenty of people got a kick out of this when it premiered, but it just didn't do an awful lot for me. I'm pretty sure that everything in here you've seen a million times before. A hyper-capable super soldier fighting for his country that turns against him. A rescue mission to save the little girl being held hostage, characters getting shot off screen and telling the hero to leave them while they stay behind with a grenade, turning the gas on the stove to blow up the entire house, a fight scene on a plane where the hero opens a henchman's parachute so he gets sucked outside, an overly macho, counterintuitive fistfight at the end, when they could have just shot each other. None of this is exciting because we've seen it so many times before. And here's the thing, I don't need every movie I watch to be some auteur's wet dream and contain some deep, meaningful, pretentious message, but your film has to have a purpose, even if that purpose is just to be entertaining for a little while, but The Grey Man just isn't. What's crazy to me is this film had a budget of £200 million, Netflix's most expensive movie ever made. They managed to get the directors of the two latest Avengers movies, some of the highest grossing movies of all time, got some great A-list actors in here, but it still feels cheap. You'd think with that sort of money behind it, the film would look amazing, wouldn't you? Well, it doesn't. It looks shit. Bear in mind that The Fellowship of the Ring had a budget of $93 million, and Revenge of the Sith had a budget of $113 million, and they came out nearly 20 years ago. Now, don't get me wrong, there is some stuff to like in here. There are a few really cool camera shots, but they often get negated by poor editing. Ana de Armas and Chris Evans are great, but Ana was wasted due to so little screen time, and Chris's character reminded me too much of Henry Cavill's from Mission Impossible Fallout. I'm sure it was unintentional, but I was way too distracted by the coincidence of taking the leader of an iconic superhero team, giving him a mustache and making him the villain in a high-budget action movie. I know I've probably come across way too harsh on The Grey Man, but it's more from a place of disappointment than it is pure rage. The fight choreography was phenomenal and Ryan Gosling is always likeable, but I can't help but feel that the whole cast and crew were just wasted potential on this flick. I hate to hammer home the same point over and over again, but how does a film with so much money look so bad? Scream. It's a franchise that always draws attention to the genre it belongs to and kind of pokes fun at it in an endearing way, instead of leaning into full-on spoof territory. The first film mocked the slasher genre, the sequel mocked the concept of sequels, and the third ripped into trilogies and the way they take something already established and flip it on its head. This new entry in the series tackled the idea of the requel, a modern trend of taking classic horror IPs, retconning the previous entry so only the original is canon, and bringing back original characters to tie the old and the new together. It's a fun concept, and it suits the Scream franchise to always be evolving. That being said, this is ultimately a film that didn't really need to exist, and so it feels like it's spinning its wheels a lot. After Wes Craven passed away, they probably should have just left the series to rest with him. The film was pretty entertaining throughout. I enjoyed the Dead Meat cameo, and this might be the best in the series after the original, at portraying that sense of paranoia and having you questioning who the killer might be. I had my suspicions, but I was never 100% sure as to who it would end up being. Although, I think the killer's motivation is somewhat lacking in depth and believability. The killers in the original were sick and had a motive, and all of the sequel's killers were related to the original cast in some way. Here it feels a little contrived because they needed a reveal for the climax. Now, I'm okay with the characters drawing attention to horror stereotypes, but there are so many name drops of famous movies and scenes where characters compare their circumstances to that of a film that I found it a little distracting. Off the top of my head, they verbally reference Psycho, Gone with the Wind, Halloween, Friday the 13th, Child's Play, The Babadook, and It Follows. The series has always been self-referential, but this one went a bit overboard and was a bit too sort of wink-wink, nudge-nudge for me. I think they could have done a bit more with the legacy characters than they actually did, but I do always enjoy seeing Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, and David Arquette together on screen. Sidney Prescott is still up there as one of the genre's top final girls, and it's always great to see Dewey doing his thing and protecting the town. Scream 2022 isn't exactly high art, but it's fun enough. I'm probably coming at Persuasion from a bit of an uninformed place since I haven't read the original Jane Austen novel, but I just don't think that this was very well written. But considering Austen is one of the world's most revered authors and plenty of people love this book, I'm going to assume that this is the fault of the screenwriter as opposed to the initial source material. I'm not entirely sure who it is that I'm supposed to be rooting for in this film. None of the characters are particularly likeable, with the exception of Walter and Mary, and they're not even supposed to be likeable. It's only because of Richard E. Grant and Mia McKenna-Bruce's performances that their characters are pretty watchable. I know Anne is supposed to be the protagonist, and she would be fine if she wasn't so self-obsessed and melodramatic. She blows everything out of proportion, and the constant fourth wall breaking is just obnoxious. I think they were going for the Enola Holmes or Fleabag vibe, but I just found it to be irritating. There is some pretty bad dialogue in here, like, "Now we're worse than exes, we're friends," and the way she describes her relationship with Frederick as a cosmic loss was honestly laughable. In fact, I don't particularly know why Anne likes Shovelface over here so much anyway. He doesn't do or say anything to stand out from any other man in the movie. I know Dakota Johnson was trying, but I felt more chemistry between her and her cousins than I did with her long-lost lover. However, on a positive note, I thought that the music and score was pretty good considering the quality of everything else. There is also one scene where the families go to watch an operatic concert that really stands out. It was shot incredibly well, and the audio mixing was great, and managed to do more in 2 minutes without dialogue than it did in the half hour prior. Far from great, but not terrible. Despite my initial horrified reaction to Lightyear's poster and Buzz's redesign back when it was revealed, I will say that this might be Pixar's best looking film. The asset models are so well done that the shot of a planet early on could have been CGI for a live action movie. It was incredible. On top of that, the first 25 minutes or so are really great, and a kind of a child-targeted short film version of Interstellar, but it shortly fell apart not long afterwards. The tone was set pretty early on when I heard a Wilhelm scream before the title card. After the film's first act, it quickly falls into a typical kids film with irritating, cartoonish, stereotypical characters that only serve as a detriment to the overall tale that the film is trying to tell. They constantly screw up Buzz's plans, which I get was supposed to be their arc, where they became more confident in themselves, but it just drove a wedge between them and me for the most part. Buzz's journey itself was an old cliche of a renegade hero who likes to work alone but has to come around to accepting the help of others. This is the same arc he has in Toy Story. Now, I suppose you could say that Buzz in the original Toy Story was based on Buzz in this one, but that doesn't make for a satisfying sequel/prequel/reboot/spin-off. The humour often fell flat for me, with the punchlines being predictable and ultimately not very good. I understand that this is primarily a movie for kids, but like I said earlier, Pixar has proven that children's films don't have to be lowbrow. I will say though that the same-sex relationship in this film is done really well and isn't shoved down your throat like I thought it would be. I think that the screenwriter clearly understands that for something to be normalised, it needs to feel normal and not like a gimmick that's used to appear progressive. Overall, it's a very inoffensive, if creatively bankrupt film that does some things right, but I'll probably forget this time next year. I think that the biggest problem with this movie is one that's shared by the whole Fantastic Beasts franchise. It's a story that nobody really asked for, led by characters that shouldn't even be involved, and overblown to span 5 films. I say 5 films as that was the plan, but this movie performed so badly that it managed to sink any chance the series had to wrap up this nonsensical story. That's right folks, Fantastic Beasts 4 and 5 have been cancelled. Despite what anyone at Warner Brothers would try to tell me, it's painfully obvious that there wasn't a roadmap planned out for these movies. This just isn't cohesive with the previous film, or the film before that. Credence's hairstyle changes drastically from movie to movie, despite the time difference being mere months. Grindelwald has been played by a different actor in every entry, and Tina was mostly absent from this one for seemingly no real reason. I understand that COVID happened and that actors might have had other contractual obligations, but we were over halfway through this series, and it still feels like a hodgepodge of ideas. I mean, the Star Wars sequel trilogy felt more cohesive, and that's saying something. If you cast your mind back to The Crimes of Grindelwald, Lita Lestrange died at the end, and in this one, everybody seems to have forgotten about it, including Newt's brother who was in love with her. Queenie's betrayal in that movie also had no effect or impact on the story of this one, and by the end, she's back with the good guys anyway. At a few points they played some of the John Williams tracks like Nimbus 2000 and Hedwig's theme, which made no sense. It seemed like a cheap attempt at playing on nostalgia rather than doing something interesting with its own story, because, let's all be honest, if it wasn't for Harry Potter, none of us would be watching these movies. This will seem nitpicky for sure, but what's the deal with the title? The Secrets of Dumbledore? It's bad. Not only does it sound like a fanfiction written by a tween, but it isn't even all that relevant to the plot. What even is the secret? Is it Albus being gay? Is it Aberforth having a son? Neither of these plot points are the main focus of this particular story, so it just sounds odd. But despite these criticisms, I will say that this film is nowhere near as bad as I thought it was going to be. It's miles and above higher than the last one, as the plot made sense and wasn't painfully contrived to make set pieces happen. Jude Law and Mads Mikkelsen are the highlights and give the best performances in the movie without a doubt. Mads is the best Grindelwald, don't at me, and I can totally see how this lunatic could have manipulated people into joining his cause way more than Johnny Depp's version. I love how creative the studio are getting with the capabilities of magic and how it can be used differently in fight scenes. Special shout out to the dude who got turned into a Banksy. It's way more interesting when magic is used in the films in interesting ways as opposed to just firing sparks at each other. But despite the movie's first half being a bit dull, the second definitely picks up and leads to a satisfying finale. Which is a shame really, as soon as the story starts to pick up its feet, the thing has the plug pulled. Oh man, I was so excited for this. Now I suppose you can call this a bit of a wildcard entry since it's a TV show and not a movie, but when I was putting this list together on Letterboxd, it let me include limited series, so it's on the list. Don't like it? Find someone that cares, I guess. This was a show that had a whole lot of potential, far more than it actually delivered on. As someone who grew up with the prequels, being able to jump back into that era with Ewan and Hayden back on screen seemed too good to be true, and I guess it was for one of them. Hayden was barely in this. His entire presence in the show was one shot where he stands about half a mile away, one flashback sequence the last 5 minutes, and a glimpse of half of his face in the final episode. I know he was in the Vader suit for a lot of it, but let's be honest, who cares? I'm sure it was great for him to be able to get back into that role and play the big bad, but as a viewer, you can't tell who's in there. Ewan was great as always and does a good job of slowly introducing more Alec Guinnessisms into his performance as he gets older, which is truly admirable. His chemistry with Lyra Blair as a young Princess Leia pretty much carries the show. It's at its most engaging when these two are on screen together. The CGI is pretty great for the most part, and I'm glad that we got Jimmy Smits back as Bail Organa. More love for the prequels, please. But the show's biggest failure is its story and creative decisions. Reva was kind of a pointless character in the grand scheme of things, as nothing she did really affected the plot in any significant way. I don't know why Bail's response to not hearing from Obi-Wan for so long is to send him a detailed message including Luke's location. Episode 4 was largely irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. How did Reva teleport to the end of this tunnel in episode 3? Why was Flea in the show? Why didn't Bale just hire a bounty hunter to rescue Leia? Why did 3 grown men and professional kidnappers struggle so much to catch a little girl in an open forest? Yes, the show was a letdown, and it did not live up to the hype, but there were a couple sequences that I really enjoyed. Seeing Qui-Gon at the end was honestly emotional, and I liked the shootout in episode 2, and the final encounter between Obi-Wan and Anakin was truly chilling. Overall though, as a complete show, not very strong. Why, God, why did this have to be a musical? Despite being a musician myself, I've never really been a fan of these kinds of films because the constant breaking out in a song just pulls me out of whatever story I was trying to get sucked into. It probably works a lot better in a theatre production because the wobbly sets and camp acting normally give it an uncanny feeling anyway, but in a regular movie, it very rarely works for me. Yet, the biggest problem I have with Spirited is that it would be significantly stronger if it wasn't a musical. The songs themselves are grossly overproduced and pitch-corrected beyond belief, and every time a new one starts, it slams the brakes on the story's pacing. In its credit, the film does try to address this in a satirical way by making fun of films that always break out into song, but it shamefully doesn't seem to understand, just because you address that it's corny, it doesn't make it any less corny. The best parts of Spirited are ultimately when it stops trying to do something different and just conforms to the standard A Christmas Carol storyline. I always hate to put a film down for doing something different and creative, but every time Christmas Present tries to show a memory and Clint flips the table and ignores what he's saying, it quickly becomes irritating. Most of the humour just doesn't land for me. There is one joke that got me to nose exhale, but that was quickly squandered by a cheap slapstick gag that killed any comedic value the moment had. And that's the key problem here. Despite a generally intriguing premise, the film suffers from a serious case of tonal whiplash. You can't go from the typical Will Ferrell humour and Ryan Reynolds antics to handling topics like suicide in children. There's a scene where Christmas Present is trying to remember Tiny Tim's name, and despite Clint telling him like 30 times, he still can't remember. But not long before that, someone mentions having a tramp stamp on the front and the back. I honestly don't know who this movie is for. Is it for kids or adults? Was it trying to hammer home a serious message, or just be a bit of fun? The lack of cohesion in its emotional direction was too jarring to be able to fully appreciate anything that it was going for. Despite all that, I do actually think that it manages to tie it all together in a satisfying way in the end. The climax makes it worth enduring the valley so that you can experience the peaks. Each character kind of gets their own thematic conclusion, so in spite of its weaker moments, I think it sticks the landing. This is also another example of Octavia Spencer choosing a very subpar movie to act in just so that she can be the absolute standout. You gotta love it. Also, Jimmy Fallon is in this. Pearl is another one of those movies where I'm not entirely sure why it actually exists. It's a prequel to Ty West's X that came out back in March and follows Pearl, the elderly antagonist of that movie. I'm aware that director Ty West was given the go-ahead to shoot this side by side with X, and I'm sure that it served as a good opportunity for Mia Goth to study Pearl as a character. However, I can't help but feel that this film doesn't really have a purpose existing alongside its sister feature. In all fairness, the movie runs a very tight ship at 1 hour and 42 minutes long, and has a focused vision that it sticks to throughout the runtime. I suppose it is nice to get some backstory for Pearl to flesh out her character, instead of having her be just some form of mysterious evil. However, the film makes the cardinal sin of demystifying its once intriguing original villain. I think what made her an unsettling antagonist in the original film was how much of an overreaction her motive ultimately was. She hates being made to feel old, unwanted, or unattractive, and will kill anyone who makes her feel that way so that she can keep living this delusion that she's still young and pretty. That was a terrifying concept, but Pearl sort of does away with all that by telling us straight up that she was crazy to begin with. I like the idea that society had created a monster in her by hiding her away and making her out to be old and gross. But according to this film, Pearl had always been a homicidal maniac, even in her youth. At the beginning of the movie, she skewers a duck onto a pitchfork for no real reason, and eventually moves on to people because they threaten her dreams of becoming a famous dancer/movie star. It's just way less interesting than it could have been. Ultimately though, Mia Goth is great in the role and brings a large sense of charisma to Pearl. From an acting performance, I think she's probably better in this than she was in X, even if the film itself doesn't follow suit. I suppose that's the main takeaway I have from Pearl. Despite knowing where all the pieces ultimately have to fall, the film does a good job of making the journey to get there interesting and entertaining. You know what? Like I said, as a fan of movies and video games, I understand well enough that when they cross over, it's never really good. Yeah, whilst Uncharted is certainly not going to win an Oscar anytime soon, I actually thought it was a fairly enjoyable romp. Yes, it's silly and very camp, but then again, so is the source material that it's based off. I do think the casting was kind of off, considering Sully is meant to be in his mid-60s and Nate is 31 in the first game. Mark Wahlberg and Tom Holland are way too young for their respective roles. I can see why some people would have thought Tom Holland is a good fit, considering he's very athletic and does a lot of his own stunts, but he's not my Nathan Drake. The two leads just aren't the same people as their characters from the games. They made Nate a bartender for some reason, and the way that Sully and Chloe betray each other every 5 minutes does get tiresome after a while. I know they say there's no honour among thieves, but it's just not in line with the characters I know. However, while it's easy for me to sit here and complain about this now, 20 minutes into the movie, I kind of forgot about it. It's not a very faithful adaptation of the source material, but when you just accept it and get on board for what it has in store, the movie is a pretty fun time. The action is as dramatic and over the top as it should be. There's a point where Nate literally spits fire at someone, it's hilarious, and the raw charm of the games does translate pretty well. It was nice to get a cameo from Nolan North, who voices Nate in the video games if you didn't know, but it was a little heavy-handed in execution. There's a part where Nate and Chloe fall out of a plane, land in the ocean and swim to the shore, and Nolan North says,
"Hey, something like that happened to me once."
It was just a bit much for me, to be honest. Considering it wasn't trying to strictly adapt any one of the games, it kind of pillaged certain plot points and set pieces from different titles, and found a way to shove them all into this one movie, which in some ways is quite impressive, but in others is a tad heavy-handed. Against all odds, Uncharted was a decently entertaining movie. You've seen one, you've seen them all. If that's not a self-fulfilling prophecy, I don't know what is. We seem to be having a renaissance of campy whodunits lately. Not that I'm complaining, I can't quite explain why, but I do enjoy the hallmarks of a typical British murder mystery party. However, See How They Run just doesn't really do anything for me. Don't get me wrong, it's a perfectly well-directed film with a good cast and a light-hearted tone. It should be right down my alley, but ultimately it failed to truly grasp my interest. This might be my fault because I watched it 4 days after Glass Onion, which is a much better example of this kind of film. It goes for the cheeky meta take on the genre that's been popular in recent years, but fails to do anything interesting or different with the concept. If you want a chaotic take on the traditional murder mystery, then there are just way better movies to check out instead. If you want a balls-to-the-wall comedic approach, then watch Clue, or if you want something tightly written with a satisfying payoff, then watch Knives Out. Despite all that, it's a fairly enjoyable romp for the most part. Sam Rockwell and Saoirse Ronan do a good job of leading the film, and the most enjoyable character for me by far was Adrian Brody's Leo Kopernik, which is a shame really, as he spends so little time on screen. We do occasionally flash back to get a bit more of him, and I found those sequences to be the most entertaining part of the movie. I found that it was more fun to just spend a day with these characters than it was actually trying to piece together who the killer is. There are some funny moments here and there, and a lot of very aesthetically pleasing camera work, but ultimately I think the film struggles to do anything with the premise that we haven't seen a million times before. Where the Crawdads Sing is actually a movie that my girlfriend watched months before I did. I seem to remember her saying that she liked it, so I added it to my list knowing I'd get around to it eventually. And after I watched it, yeah, it was okay. It's got a decently intriguing premise and is pretty atmospheric through its use of locations, but I do think it's ultimately a bit melodramatic. The film isn't awful by any stretch of the imagination, but also isn't as emotionally profound as it thinks it is. The concept is engaging enough, with a girl accused of the murder of a young man being sentenced to death, while occasionally cutting back to the events in her life that led to this moment. However, the issue for me lies in these courtroom scenes specifically. For one, the pacing of these sequences end up killing any sense of suspense that would have otherwise been formed in the flashbacks, and secondly, they contain every courtroom procedural cliche in the book. Every time a shady lawyer gives the defendant a shitty look or someone yells, "Objection!" I just curled up into a little ball. I did find myself appreciating the personal complexity of Chase's character throughout the story though. He's obviously not a good person deep down, but the typical narcissistic traits you'd associate with a mentally abusive partner are there, like insincere apologies and manipulating you into thinking they're different. As an audience, we're obviously privy to certain things that the protagonist isn't, but I can see how, towards the start, Kaya would think that Chase was a nice person. It added a nice dilemma for her to struggle with in regards to her loyalties and romantic intentions, although I did find it a little distracting how the two love interests kind of look the same. But the movie was decently entertaining for the most part, largely down to Daisy Edgar Jones's performance, but the execution of certain scenes and the melodrama of it all seemed a little Netflix original to me, as opposed to a full theatrical release. It's better than the first one. Ever since its release in 2009, I've never met a single person who loves the original Avatar, so James Cameron delivering us a sequel 13 years later was a bit of a head-scratcher if I'm being honest. However, once again, he managed to push the boundaries of current technology and deliver an absolutely gorgeous movie from start to finish. It does help that I watched this in 4DX, so the whole whooshing air and splashes of water really immerses you in the landscapes of Pandora. The whole world feels far more fleshed out than it did in the original film, with new species, plant life and scenery. The new characters introduced in this film are fairly run-of-the-mill in the grand scheme of things, but seem so full of life and personality in comparison to returning cast members. Despite not being able to recall any of their names, all of the children in this film feel way more developed than Jake and Neytiri do, considering those two have had double the screen time. In spite of these accomplishments though, the movie is a bit too long, I reckon. 192 minutes long. Now, I don't have an issue with longer films, my favourite movie is The Fellowship of the Ring, but it does have to justify its runtime, and unfortunately, I don't think that this does. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that it's only 3 hours because the first one was, and it becomes a talking point for the film. Like the first Avatar, the plot is rather simple, with Jake and his family being hunted down by the Sky People, so they have to go on the run to avoid getting killed. There's also some details that felt a little thrown together to me. According to this movie, both Sigourney Weaver and Stephen Lang had a child, not together, two different kids, before they died in the first one. Don't really know when that happened or why it wasn't mentioned before, but it did make these two films feel a little disjointed. Overall though, Avatar: The Way of Water has a drawn-out plot and features villains whose motivations aren't very clear. Despite the thing being 3 hours long, all the pieces on the board appear to be mostly back where they were at the start of the film, so that the next sequel can carry on as planned. I'm probably not going to rewatch this, but if I do decide to before the third one, it will definitely be over multiple sittings. Man, this was a long time ago, wasn't it? It seems ages since I watched this in theatres, and the main takeaway I have from the film is that it is long. I seem to remember that when I got home and checked, it's 2 hours and 39 minutes, but let me tell you, it felt like it was at least 3 hours. It's one of those experiences that seems like it's wrapping up, but carries on going for a little bit more, except it did that for 40 minutes. But here's the weird thing, despite how long it drags, the ending still feels rushed. I don't know how Baz Luhrmann managed to do it, but he made a film that was too slow and too fast at the same time. There is a lot to dislike about Elvis, like distracting editing, obvious examples of ADR throughout, Tom Hanks' awful accents, and some very out-of-place modern needle drops. It's safe to say that on my 50s rock and roll biopic bingo card, I did not have Doja Cat and Eminem on the soundtrack there. I understand that Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, played a significant role in the man's life, but I do question the decision to have the whole movie played through him as a framing device. It doesn't really benefit the movie, and seems a little insensitive. I understand completely why they did it, but they obviously chose to exclude certain things from Elvis's past, which makes sense in context of the story they wanted to tell, but could be seen as conveniently omitting details that would paint the man in a more negative light. Things like the allegations of him ripping off black artists without credit and involving himself romantically with a then 14-year-old despite him being 24. It's quite easy to go hard at this movie, but ultimately, it's as high on the list as it is because it's shot phenomenally well and Austin Butler's performance carried the shit out of it. Those two things combined with Presley's music knocked up my score on their own. I'd have a hard time recommending it, but there are definitely things that I can appreciate about it. Well, here's a surprise. I found that I tend to have a habit of saying that films have great concepts but are often executed poorly and squander their premise. Fall is actually one of those films where the complete opposite is true. It's a very competently shot, edited, and acted movie, but the majority of its issues actually lie within the script. So the plot is that Becky lost her boyfriend to a mountain climbing accident, and so her friend Hunter thinks a good way for her to get over it would be to climb a 2,000-foot abandoned radio tower in the California desert. After climbing to the top, the ladder breaks and they get stuck at the top. You might think, well, that was a stupid decision, wasn't it? Yes, it was. But the hilarity comes in when you realise they don't tell anyone where they're going or what they're doing. They even pass a danger of death sign. The dialogue wasn't great, and there were a few occasions where the lines the actor had to deliver had me cringe a little bit. You know that kind of speech that 30 to 40-year-old men write for teenage girls? Yeah, that kind of stuff. On the other side of the coin though, the initial climb to the top of the tower had me very uncomfortable for the entire duration. The delicate balance of sound design, cinematography, and editing just make the experience nauseating to witness. It built a sense of dread that usually doesn't affect me in Hollywood movies. I actually had the entire cinema to myself, I was the only one in the room, and I was sat with my knees up to my chest saying, oh fuck that. As someone who is a big fan of horror and thriller movies, who doesn't usually have a physical reaction to stuff, I want to give this movie the biggest compliment I can for that. I've seen a few people comparing the concept to 47 Meters Down, and I can see why. However, I personally drew more parallels to The Descent. I don't believe that Fall is anywhere near the league of that movie, but I could certainly sense some inspiration or similarities between the two, especially with certain plot details that develop later on. The tension only builds further when the relationship between the two starts to crumble as Hunter is called out for being a shitty friend. However, the very preventable course of events combined with a rather predictable plot twist make for a film that would have been far more effective under a different writer. It did make me feel sick throughout though, so good job, movie. Back when I watched Spiderhead in July, I said that this is obviously going to be another one of those Netflix things that trend for a few weeks and then everyone immediately forgets existed. And oh boy, I don't think I've ever said anything that has aged better. Did anyone else watch this? And if you did, was it the week that it was trending #1 on the homepage? Anyway, it's another one of those sci-fi humanity was the real villain all along movies, and to be honest, it doesn't really need to exist. It doesn't approach any of its themes with any real care or sincerity. In fact, I don't really know what the message is. What is the message? Drugs are bad? Selfish genius millionaires are bad? Well, duh, we didn't need this film to tell us that. In spite of the confusing thematics though, it was still a pretty enjoyable watch. It's funny, back when I watched Dunkirk, I found that it's a movie I enjoyed much more after it finished because of all the thoughts it left me with, but the film itself was rather boring to watch. This is kind of the opposite. I can't really think of a whole lot to praise about it, but I just remember it being oddly entertaining. The story follows a pharmaceutical company that has managed to create drugs that simulate emotions. For example, you can buy happiness. As always, Miles Teller gives a great emotional performance, and it is undoubtedly a real good time to watch Chris Hemsworth go all zany on us. This is the second movie of the year with an MCU hero acting in a kooky villain performance. You can clearly tell that he's having a good time. It was directed competently. Joseph Kosinski will show up again on this list, much higher, and I have to respect the use of You Make My Dreams. What a banger. Here we are with the franchise's 5th entry, 7th if you count Alien vs Predator, and I can confidently say that this is the best one since the 1987 original. And I say this as someone that actually can get some enjoyment out of Predator 2. It's not that bad. I think that what Prey manages to accomplish, which truly makes it stand out from its siblings, is how it puts a fresh spin on the material while still remaining faithful to the original in tone and premise. We're back in the familiar setting of a small clan in the forest getting picked off until one survivor manages to overcome the threat. But having the film take place in 1719 does a great job of placing restraint on our protagonists. You'd think that having the Predator hunt earlier on in the course of human civilization would work against us due to the lack of technology and firepower. Yet the tribe's surface level limitations actually work to their benefit, since they have to become much more skillful trackers and hunters than the commandos from the first film ever did. This aspect made for a far more engaging watch than the series' previous few entries. The movie is very well shot and features some beautiful landscapes of Calgary, which harken back to the scenery found in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Predator himself has a cool new design which, again, is pretty faithful to the original, but tweaked ever so slightly enough to still feel fresh. My only real issue is that I feel like it dragged a little in the middle. Usually what I would suggest in these kinds of scenarios is to trim some fat off of the movie, but since it runs at only 99 minutes already, the film is already relatively tight. Maybe it would have worked better for me as a short film, but you can't deny that the execution of what it set out to do is pretty extraordinary. Uh-oh, hot take alert. So, The Batman is kind of a polarizing film for me. I'm not the biggest superhero fan, but I have always loved the Dark Knight trilogy for how they work as crime films as opposed to Batman films. And I do think that a lot of what makes those films work is present here, although there are aspects that hold it back for me. To address the elephant in the room, it does not need to be 177 minutes long, Jesus. Here's the thing, I complained about Elvis being long because it seemed to drag on, but I remember a lot of what happened. Conversely, the Batman seemed to go by a lot quicker, but I remember very little about what happened in it. I don't think that the plot is complex enough, nor are the characters developed enough to warrant it being this lengthy. With the exception of Bruce Wayne and Alfred, I'm not a big fan of how this movie interprets classic Batman villains. I find that the Batman himself is rather one-note, Falcone is portrayed in the same cliché way he always is, and Gordon is just a catalyst to let Batman do whatever he wants without the cops interfering. And it's a shame because I know all the actors are giving this their all. You can tell that Pattinson, Serkis, Turturro, Farrell, and Jeffrey Wright are all giving 100%, but their writing was just a little underdeveloped for me. I like the concept of playing the Riddler more straight and grounding him in reality when compared to his Jim Carrey counterpart in Batman Forever, but Paul Dano's performance just strikes me as a bit cringe. There's a scene where he's trying to intimidate someone over a video chat and he's literally copying Heath Ledger's scene in The Dark Knight verbatim. I just don't buy him as an intimidating person that would be able to frighten anyone in the way he does here. It's cool how they clearly tried to base him on the Zodiac Killer, but by pure coincidence, I happened to watch Zodiac the night before, which made the comparison a lot less subtle. The whole film has a dark, moody atmosphere with the weather raining 90% of the time. The killer is trying to make a political statement with his attacks and is leaving breadcrumb-like trails for the police to follow. One of our two male leads is brash and impatient to get results in the investigation, and the other is more reserved and calculated. Have you noticed that all of this could apply to the Batman, or Seven? It's nice to pay homage to your influences, but there is a point where I think I'd just rather be watching that movie. On the flip side, the score for the film is great and does a fantastic job of building the hype and or suspense based on what the scene needs. It does sound a bit like if the Imperial March record was skipping, but it still works well. I think the Batmobile is wicked, and I love the idea of having it be a custom-tuned muscle car instead of a military-grade tank or sci-fi supercar. The chase scene later on could easily be viewed as a horror sequence from Penguin's perspective, and I think that's a really cool, unique angle to approach this sequence. Pattinson does a good job of portraying a range of emotions through acting exclusively with the lower half of his face, and I appreciate how they leaned into him being the world's greatest detective and gave him some brains to work with instead of having computers do all the work. Like I said, I'm conflicted and may need to give it another watch, but as of now, this is where it sits. I love Oldboy to the point that it's one of my favourite movies ever, so it's safe to say that I'm always going to be excited when Park Chan-wook releases a new movie. And Decision to Leave is a romance film disguised as a police procedural thriller. This kind of bait and switch can either go one of two ways, and in all fairness, I think that the film does manage to pull it off. The constant guessing as to where it's going is kind of what drives the movie. The story is about a cop that's investigating the suspected murder of a man, but as time goes on, he starts to develop romantic feelings for the victim's wife. This gets more complicated when he begins to suspect that she may in fact be a suspect herself. The thing is expertly crafted, the plot slowly ebbs and flows around the performances of our two leads, both of whom do a great job of portraying such morally complex characters. It's actually pretty hard to say if Decision to Leave even has an antagonist, but if you're on the side that there is, it's even harder to actually deduce who it is. This is not an accessible, easy to digest film. There's so much personal ambiguity that it's really up to you to decide for yourself in a lot of ways. Park Chan-wook is great at conveying information to the audience without forcing an exposition dump down our throats. There's plenty here to be dissected on a second viewing, like the fact that the two leads speak different languages, one speaks Korean and the other Chinese. So they communicate through a translation app which represents the lack of truth and honest direct conversation in the pair's relationship. But despite its accomplishments, the film ultimately has a bit of a pacing issue, which when combined with its rather strange editing and, for me at least, bad subtitles, makes for an experience that becomes quite hard to follow. It's definitely not a bad movie, in fact it's very good, but ultimately it's not as strong as Chan-wook's previous work. War is terrifying, isn't it? If I'm going to be absolutely fair to this film, I'm not a lover of war films, so it was already on the back foot before it even began. However, as these films go, All Quiet on the Western Front is probably one of the better ones I've seen. The movie makes an impact from the very beginning with incredible cinematography and an incredibly immersive one-take tracking shot through the trenches of battle. Then we follow the journey of a German uniform that was stripped from the corpse of a dead soldier and then recycled to a young new recruit. It's honestly harrowing when you realise what these characters have in store for themselves, and the way that their supposed allies try to disguise the truth makes for a really compelling start to the film. The end of the movie is also handled really well. I won't spoil what happens, because if you're thinking about watching it, you should experience it blind. Everything from the script, the performances, and the score come together to create an honest and powerful critique of war, and especially how it was handled in the early 20th century. You feel personally impacted by the events you've been forced to witness, and lightly heartbroken by the poor timing and leadership of each side's commanders. So the opening and the ending are great, but it's the entire middle section that falls short for me. Running at around 2.5 hours long, the film feels bloated for the story it's trying to tell, because God forbid we ever have a short war story. Oscar sweep, am I right? It's nice when we occasionally cut from the battlefield to keep up with the French and German officials, but the movie still drags its heels in the second act. It never really uses its runtime to make us care for any of the characters here, other than Paul and Kat, which honestly negates the impact of certain scenes later on. It's stunning to watch, I'd have loved to have seen this in a cinema, and it is novel to see the war portrayed from the opposite sides that we're used to. But I don't feel that All Quiet on the Western Front truly does anything new for the genre. There are a few ideas that I appreciate here and there, but ultimately there isn't much in it that I haven't already seen before. This was one horny movie. Now, I suppose that 3000 Years of Longing's biggest strength is how totally unpredictable it is. Luckily, none of the promotional material gave too much away, which allowed the movie to sort of naturally unfold in ways that were equally as surprising as they were entertaining. The movie completely flips the traditional genie granting 3 wishes trope on its head and decides to focus more on the djinn's character instead of his powers. If you're expecting Aladdin-style antics and over-the-top wishes, then you'll likely be disappointed. It's not an action-packed adventure movie, it's actually a story about stories, and the power that they hold. How a short conversation and a few tales from someone's past can have someone reevaluate their entire priorities in life. Tilda Swinton plays Alethea, who is an independent scholar that stumbles across an ancient bottle in Istanbul. While cleaning the thing, she accidentally releases the djinn, who explains that she has 3 wishes to make, which will proceed to free him after the final one. At first, she doesn't want to make a wish and is a little suspicious of the djinn, but she slowly starts to open up as he continues to tell her stories of his past. She goes on a journey of slowly wanting less and less to be self-sufficient, and that is what truly stuck with me. In the beginning, she doesn't feel the need to have a significant other in her life, but as the narrative progresses, she comes to realise that she just wants to be loved. It's a nice sentiment that reinforces how you're never too old and it's never too late to find love again. That being said, despite my appreciation for Alethea's dynamic with the djinn, I didn't find myself all that connected to the main focus of the story, the flashbacks. I understand that they are entirely the point, but the transition from the djinn reflecting on his past to Alethea's decisions in the present felt a little rushed to me. I think that Tilda Swinton and Idris Elba have great chemistry, and the film is at its best when they were on screen together, but given the nature of the flashbacks, it didn't happen as often as I'd have liked. A decently entertaining time, but maybe don't watch with your parents. There's not much scarier than horny old people, am I right? There isn't really a movie I've seen like X before. It's a story set in the 1970s about a group of young adults on a trip to rural Texas so they can shoot an adult film, but an old couple that live nearby catch them in the act, and things go crazy. What I think is incredible about X is how it's a slasher movie where all of the protagonists are likeable. I know it sounds silly, but for a horror film to have you on the same side as all of its main characters is quite rare. I think a special shout out goes to Brittany Snow and Kid Cudi for just having so much fun with such a goofy concept, and it makes the whole thing way more fun to watch. It's pretty tightly written too, as a lot of the character deaths are foreshadowed early on through dialogue, and the editing between certain shots made for some pretty memorable moments. However, the biggest compliment I can give to this film is how it handles the theme of getting older and losing your sense of self-empowerment. It's funny how when you get old, people want to just lock you away. You're not fit enough to work, you're too much trouble to look after, and you're not even attractive enough to be seen in public. Congratulations, movie, you made me think about things I often try to avoid thinking about. It's a great concept for a horror villain. Not a monster, not a split personality lunatic, just ordinary people pushed to the limits of their societal abandonment, until it gets a prequel that undoes all of that good stuff. But I do think that the film is brought down though by how it portrays the villains. The rationale behind the motive and what they have going on in the basement is really disturbing, but they do fall into cartoonish stereotypes after a little while. It's obviously trying to lean into them looking gross and undesirable, but they look more like monsters than they do actual human beings. Well, this is the one that I think is going to get me into trouble. Everyone lost their minds when this came out. Everything Everywhere All at Once is the best thing to happen to cinema. It's so creative, it changed the game, best film of the year. Sorry, but no, not for me. Don't get me wrong, I ranked it this high, but it really didn't click with me in the same way it clearly did for everybody else. Here's what I'll say. Never before has a movie's title better represented the product. Everything Everywhere All at Once is insane. From the bonkers plot to the hyperactive editing, the film is never going to bore you. It's kind of like if ADHD manifested itself into a 2-hour feature. I can't even really explain what it's about because it's so crazy, but I'll say that there's multiverses involved, pop culture references, stylized martial arts fights, and everything in between. Believe it or not, the scene where the teenage girl beats up a security guard with a pair of dildos is one of the not weird scenes in the film. The film is occasionally funny, there's one joke in particular where they hop into a different universe and we see the intro from 2001: A Space Odyssey, but the apes have hot dog fingers. It makes sense in the context of the movie, trust me. But then a lot of it is also a bit too #random for me and tries too hard to be zany. There's references to Ratatouille and a bunch of large, stocky men leaping 8 feet into the air trying to land ass first onto a set of butt plugs. The cast were good, I imagine Jamie Lee Curtis had no idea what was going on when filming, and I did find myself emotionally invested in the dynamic of the Wang family. I was rooting for Evelyn and Wayman to stay together, and for Joy to be recognised and appreciated for being her own person. However, because of how batshit bonkers the plot is, and the way the whole thing is put together, I did find it quite hard to follow at times. I'm not sure if I was just tired when I was watching it and another viewing would have it click with me more, but if you ask me to explain how the whole multiverse bagel concept gets wrapped up in the end, I think I would struggle. But even if I didn't really know what was going on in the last act, I do know how it made me feel, so good job, movie. If I can give you any advice before going to see Barbarian, it would be go in as blind as you can. All I really knew before going in was that someone goes to an Airbnb that's been double booked, and I think that's all you need to know. My lack of any expectations, good or otherwise, worked wonders for keeping that suspense that the film thrives on. During the first half hour or so, I thought I had a general idea of where this thing is going, yet, rather excitingly, I never truly did. Pretty much all of my predictions were wrong, since it just kept throwing curveballs my way. The movie is pretty intriguing throughout the whole thing, there isn't a moment that feels boring or slow, and once everything finally kicks off, it manages to simultaneously juggle a marvelous sense of tension and mind-blowing shock value. That is until the film's conclusion, where I feel like it kind of drops the ball. I don't think that any of the movie's messaging gets properly addressed or concluded by the time the credits roll, and the journey that one character seems to go on gets undone in the span of one 5-minute scene. It wasn't what I'd call a satisfying conclusion. Justin Long's character AJ is pretty well written despite being an awful person, and fully cements the message that the film hinted at in the first act of toxic masculinity and the everyday fears that women have that most men just don't consider. I'm not necessarily sure that we needed another Aren't Men Just the Worst story in 2022, but for the most part, Barbarian handles the topic in a far more subtle and authentic fashion than other films this year. If I'm going to nitpick, I think there is an element of tonal inconsistency that runs throughout the movie. There are certain sequences that are so silly, like someone getting their whole arm torn off by another person's bare hands, that it counteracts any sense of immersion you initially had. Not that I think all films have to be 100% realistic, but at least a film like Malignant commits enough to its camp that you can view it through that lens. Barbarian doesn't really go far enough to fall into the same group, but instead comes across as tonally and thematically jarring. I'll admit, I wasn't expecting the Hugh Grant jump scare. So it was always going to be difficult for Rian Johnson to live up to, let alone beat what he did with Knives Out. But he still managed to pull off a respectable and satisfying sequel, even if it doesn't quite top the original. This is just a fun movie. I did see one person online say that calling it Glass Onion is such a coward's way to avoid calling it Chives Out, and I found that pretty hilarious. So here's the thing, the first film had such a great cast that this crew were never really going to be able to top it. Don't get me wrong, you've got Edward Norton, Dave Bautista, and Janelle Monáe, who are all great in their roles, but the original group of suspects was so perfect and full of character that this kind of lands in second place by default. The original Knives Out didn't have a single weak link, where here I find that Kathryn Hahn is criminally underused and Kate Hudson's character to be quite irritating. But despite this, Johnson manages once again to weave together a complex, intriguing, and constantly twisting mystery for us to solve. I had two suspects throughout the first two acts, which made sense to me at the time, but in the end, it managed to stump me. When the truth is revealed, it still feels naturally motivated for the killer to have done what they'd done, which I think always makes for the most satisfying mysteries. Like the original film, Glass Onion plays with time as a narrative device, and tends to hop back and forth to naturally peel back the layers of the story. I think that a few of the reveals were a little unfair on the viewer's behalf, because flashbacks later on provide us with information that wasn't really present in the original scenes. It does that thing where it cuts back to an earlier scene and reveals that a character was just off screen but we didn't see them. There's no way that you can predict that as a viewer, so sometimes it felt a bit like the movie was intentionally deceiving us instead of treating us as an observer to the crime. Daniel Craig is clearly having just as much fun as he was in the last one, which results in Benoit Blanc being a relentlessly entertaining protagonist. The film has its funny moments, most of which come from Craig himself, and is ultimately a joyous, easy watching experience. Ultimately, I suppose when comparing this one to Knives Out, The Glass Onion is actually kind of a perfect metaphor. On the surface, it's shinier, flashier, and more visually vibrant, but on the inside, it's actually a little hollow and transparent. I've been a pretty big fan of Jordan Peele's work since I first saw Get Out back in 2017. I loved that movie and really enjoyed Us when that released a few years later, so I was pretty excited when I saw that his next film was scheduled for this year. It was probably my most anticipated movie of 2022, but after finally getting to see it, in 4DX mind you, I was fairly disappointed. It was absolutely not a bad film, as my rating suggests. I liked it more than I disliked it, but I don't hold it in the same regard as I do Jordan Peele's other projects. The film is a spectacle. It's gorgeous, with some fantastic cinematography and great CGI that is a sight to behold, especially in theatres. It's very funny and oddly relatable in places, and the reveal of what's really happening is pretty cool and unique. So the movie follows a brother and sister who set out to capture the evidence of a UFO that they think is flying above the clouds next to their farm. A credit to the film is that I never really knew what was coming next, and when we eventually found out, well, I never would have guessed that. I think the film's biggest weakness by far is its characters. The humour that I talked about before is more rooted in the scenario that they find themselves in, as opposed to them being funny people. I didn't really grow to care about any of them other than OJ, and a few of them left me a bit confused as to their motivations. They act in ways that seemingly act to further the plot rather than to benefit them as real people. I think I definitely need to rewatch it at some point because a lot of the themes, like the glorification of spectacle, went completely over my head the first time, so I can definitely see myself enjoying it more in the future. However, as it currently stands, I think it's the weakest of Peele's 3 movies. I didn't see this coming. You know how sometimes you're watching a movie and have that click moment where everything all of a sudden falls into place and just makes sense? Well, Weird the Al Yankovic story actually had 2 of those click moments for me. I hadn't watched the trailer or anything before going into this, so I knew very little about it. Basically, it was Weird Al's story and Dan Radcliffe was in it. That was the extent of my knowledge. I was expecting your run-of-the-mill musician-focused biopic. Then we reached a point where, as a child, Al's father beat the living shit out of an accordion salesman with a chair. So now I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be silly and over the top. I'm down. Then the second click point came when the movie outright claims that Eat It is a 100% original song, which Michael Jackson himself copied. And then everything made sense. We're watching a parody of the biopic format itself. What begins at first as a few over-the-top gags eventually blossoms into a balls-to-the-wall concoction of carnage, which ends with Weird Al crawling through the jungle like Rambo and killing Pablo Escobar with an assault rifle. Oh, and then Madonna taking over his entire drug enterprise. Obviously, it deviates slightly from what happened in reality, but to be fair, most of these biopics embellish the truth or create fabrications for the sake of drama anyway, so what's the difference really? The film is very funny and is very silly. Daniel Radcliffe is brilliant in the role. There's a sequence where he's prancing about on stage with his shirt unbuttoned and he's got a six-pack. The thought of Weird Al being ripped is hilarious in and of itself, but apparently Dan didn't do this for the movie. He's just naturally shredded, which makes the whole thing 100 times funnier. The downside for me here is that I just don't find Weird Al's parodies to be that funny. Granted, I am in the minority as people seem to love the guy, but My Bologna, I Love Rocky Road, and Another One Rides the Bus, they don't particularly strike me as comedic gold. But the film overcomes this by inadvertently addressing it. The fact that he's perceived by everyone around him as the greatest thing that happened to music is self-deprecating enough to be endearing. Probably not going to win any Oscars, but a fun watch for what it is. Back in the first half of 2022, I watched this trailer like 20 times because it played before everything I watched. I remember being excited for it, thinking this looks cool, I can't wait to see it. Then the controversy started appearing. There was Shia LaBeouf getting sacked, the pay gap between Florence Pugh and Harry Styles, the conflicting statements from Pugh and director Olivia Wilde regarding the film's perspective on sexuality. Florence said that sex wasn't the point or the focus of the story, but Olivia claimed that it was supposed to be sexually empowering for women. Shia LaBeouf claimed he wasn't fired and that he left willingly. Olivia Wilde receives papers for custody of her children from her ex-fiancé during a live promotional event for the film. Did Harry spit on Chris Pine? Chris Pine dissociates during an interview. And after all that, I had my guard up. There's no way that this is going to be smooth sailing, is it? Now, it's not a perfect film, but I do have more positive things to say about it than I do negative. Florence Pugh is phenomenal in this movie. She provided the standout performance by far and truly brought the character of Alice to life. The film is shot exceptionally well and sets a clear example of Olivia Wilde's directing talent. I also think it might be the best looking film of the year, at least to me, it's between this and Avatar. The movie has boatloads of intrigue from the very beginning and sets up the mystery surrounding the story really well. It makes sure to glamorize the 50s lifestyle and make it seem very idealistic so that they can pull the rug from under you in the finale. So the film follows Alice, a stay-at-home wife who recently moved to the small town of Victory with her husband Jack so he can take part in a mysterious project going on at his workplace. As time progresses, things slowly start to unravel, and Alice begins to suspect that not everything is as it seems with Victory. The setup is really cool, but I was ultimately a little disappointed with how these questions were inevitably answered. Without going into full-on spoilers, it seemed like Olivia Wilde watched a double bill of a certain 2017 horror directorial debut and a 2004 romantic drama written by Charlie Kaufman before deciding, I want to do that. What started as a seemingly original concept and interesting premise devolved into something we've seen plenty of times before. I noticed that most of the creative shots used in the film made it to the trailer, which I'd seen so many times by the time that I watched it, and I felt like I'd already watched the first act. So between the lackluster finale and my pre-existing overexposure to the opening, I was only really loving the middle section of the film. But when I was enjoying it, I really was. Now, Don't Worry Darling tries to tackle themes of toxic masculinity and abusive relationships, but I think of all the films that I watched in 2022 that tried it, this one pulled it off the worst. I felt like the others tried to draw attention to the issues in general, or maybe even try to direct themselves at the people who do these bad things, but maybe don't realise how harmful their actions actually are. Don't Worry Darling felt a little insulting to me at times, and seemed to relish more in corralling women together so that they can hate on men. This was a film I enjoyed, but not without my hesitations. After learning about who she based the character of Frank on, I don't think I can trust Olivia Wilde to honestly and accurately relay information. I don't have much respect for her as a person, but I most certainly do as a director, and I suppose, at least in the context for this list, that's where it counts. The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent is a movie that you'll know straight away if you're going to enjoy or not, based on how you feel about the premise. If I tell you that you're going to watch a movie where Nicolas Cage plays himself and meets Pedro Pascal who isn't playing himself, and the two write a movie script together which ends up being the movie that you are now watching, and your reaction is positive, I think you're gonna like this. I didn't really know any of that before I started watching it, other than Nick Cage is in it, and I definitely wasn't expecting a very meta nostalgia trip through his career, and was even more taken aback by how much I actually cared about his relationship with Harvey. Nick and Pedro bounce off each other really well and create a very entertaining dynamic. It's absolutely bonkers, doesn't take itself seriously at all, and just has fun with itself. So Nick Cage gets spontaneously recruited by the CIA to help with an investigation, and he has to balance that with his family dynamic and his newfound friendship with Harvey. For such a silly concept, I think that the movie was surprisingly well written. Usually in these kinds of films, the conflicts are pretty contrived and could be resolved if the characters just talk to each other like real people. Here though, it all works together quite naturally despite its bonkers premise. The two leads have a misunderstanding around halfway through, and the circumstances leading up to it felt pretty genuine. I'm not usually one to audibly laugh at a film, I usually tend to just crack a smile or a little snort, but I did actually get a few chuckles in here. The scene where Nick and Pedro are tripping on LSD was great, and Pedro in particular elevated the whole thing with his performance. He comes across as so sweet and likeable that you root for him the whole time. It's a fun movie. I was naturally pretty excited to see this one because I loved Alex Garland's last two movies, Ex Machina and Annihilation, but I'm also a fan of those minimalistic, slow burn movies. Men tells the story of Harper, who goes on holiday to the countryside after the death of her husband. She's trying to take some time away and heal, but something strange is happening with the locals, which results in Harper fearing for her life. The film is very tense when it tries to be, and makes a fantastic use of silence to build dread. Most horror movies try to ramp up the fear factor with rising strings or an unsettling score, but Garland clearly understands that there isn't much more effective than nothing. There's a whole section of the movie, about 20 minutes, without any dialogue. There's a sequence where Harper shouts down a tunnel and uses the echoes to harmonise with herself, which has its own thematic resonance, but those sounds come back a little later as a part of the film's score, which was honestly really cool and well executed. The movie isn't trying to be the scariest thing you've ever seen, but it does do a good job of exploring the responses people can have to grief and guilt. We discover after a while that Harper's husband was emotionally and physically abusive and threatened to kill himself if she left him. She's obviously struggling to deal with the circumstances surrounding his death, and it's even left ambiguous to the audience whether it was an accident or a suicide. The film tackles these deeply embedded issues in a really compelling way, because you start to think things like, if the husband did kill himself after warning Harper that he'd do so, is this kind of his way of controlling her from beyond the grave? She'll never be able to free herself of him if there isn't anything tangible to separate yourself from. He can gaslight her into thinking it was her fault and essentially have the last word. The gimmick of the movie is that all the men in the nearby village are all played by the same man. Rory Kinnear does a good job of portraying all these different sketchy weirdos who all play some part in each representing a trait of toxic masculinity. The vicar suggests that she might have actually had some sort of blame in her husband's death because she didn't give him a second chance. There's a copper that's dismissive of her feelings when her stalker gets released from jail due to the lack of legal standing. Jeffrey is ultimately the nice guy of the story, but even he suffers from passive traits like demanding to buy Harper a drink and not taking no for an answer, and trying to be the hero when she thinks someone is breaking into the house. The last act does get really bizarre, the last 15 minutes especially, but not in a way that I think is a benefit to the film. It seems to be a bit weird for the sake of it, and I actually heard people in my cinema groaning during that sequence. I think it does what it sets out to do quite well, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people don't like it for one reason or another. I can see people taking issue with the way it handles the themes, and I can see some people getting bored, but I enjoyed my time with it, so that's why it's here. Bones and All is a romantic horror based on the 2015 novel of the same name. We've got Taylor Russell and Timothée Chalamet as a pair of cannibals that meet each other on the road and fall in love during their trip across the country. I was honestly expecting this to be a highbrow Twilight, and it was simultaneously exactly that, and so much more. It's kind of hard to explain, but the movie did a great job of constantly surprising me and keeping me on my toes. I never really knew where it was going or how it was going to end. It's a story of love, loss, and ultimately, temptation. The score is hauntingly minimalistic, and the beautiful cinematography works wonders to convey a grand sense of scale, but also a building dread of isolation. Even in its slower sections, the film is always captivating. We don't get a clean, definitive answer to all of our questions, and when we do, it's often not very satisfying, but in a good way. The themes at the core of this movie always convince you that everything will be alright in the end. We're often dealt a shitty hand that's ultimately out of our control, but all we can do is choose how to proceed with what options we have available to us. It's saying, support your loved ones, even when it's not easy. The whole cannibalism aspect is obviously the hook of the film, but when you think about what narrative purpose it serves, you notice that it can be applicable to many other aspects of life. I interpreted the cannibalism as a metaphor for addiction, but I've heard other people say that to them, it was a substitute for homosexuality or living outside of the societal norms. In some ways, I think my theory makes more sense, since the characters are trying to overcome their urge to feed in order to live out a happy, normal life. But then again, the theory of LGBTQ representation ties in with the film's message of owning who you are. You can try and run away from your problems, but if they ultimately lie with you yourself, you'll never really be able to escape them. I'll say that the movie was brought down for me a little bit with how our two leads, at least to me, didn't seem to have much chemistry. I'm not particularly sure at what point they decided that they were in love as opposed to just friends, but it didn't really seem like an organic shift in dynamic to me. I thought Chalamet was fine in the role, but he didn't really pull out any of the acting chops that we know he has until the final 20 minutes. For most of the movie, he's just another one of his cool, mysterious loner characters. But in the end, Bones and All is beautiful and horrifying. It's delicate, yet brutal. It's a film for the romantics and the weirdos. Now, if you're like me and you happen to fall into both of those categories, then this might just be for you. Well, this was a pleasant surprise. I'd seen a few of the trailers leading up to the release of Bullet Train, and I thought it was going to be one of those typical action movies, like Die Hard on a Train kind of thing. I was definitely not expecting a tongue-in-cheek, Guy Ritchie-esque romp that didn't take itself that seriously, and if I have anything to say about it, it's thank God it did, as it was better than it had any right to be. The film is fast-paced, like a bullet train, and the direction is loosely similar to films like Snatch and Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. We're talking quick cutaways to loosely referenced events and that typical dry-witted British humour that harkens back to the late 90s, early noughties. All the characters are entertaining to watch, and the comedy aspects are done pretty well, considering it got a few snickers out of me, and I very rarely laugh out loud when it comes to movies. There are a few unexpected cameos that are oddly memorable, and because of what I thought the film was going to be, I was surprised by how shockingly violent it was, albeit in a fun way, not a harrowing way. So the movie follows Ladybug, an infamously unlucky assassin who fills in for a colleague to commit a murder on a train in Tokyo. However, he gets a bit more than he bargained for when he realises that he's not the only killer on the train, and everybody's plans and interests get muddled up in an intense game of cat and mouse moving at 200 miles per hour. In a weird way though, I think the film's identifying trait and biggest strength is also its greatest weakness. The thing just doesn't slow down. It's entertaining throughout, but considering that it runs for a full 127 minutes, it becomes a little exhausting after a while. I get that it's trying to be action-packed and keep things moving, but we do occasionally need those moments of respite in order to absorb what we've experienced and make the following action sequence hit even harder. It's definitely a fun time, but you might find your brain a little overstimulated by the end. Most of the cast are great, although I didn't love Joey King's performance. Brad Pitt was fun, and it didn't feel like he was playing himself. The same goes for Aaron Taylor-Johnson, Brian Tyree Henry, Hiroyuki Sanada, and Michael Shannon. If you just want to go on a ride for 2 hours, have some laughs and some thrills, then this might be the one for you. Marcel the Shell with Shoes On is a movie that had been on my list for a good few months before I actually got around to watching the thing. I didn't really know what to expect, but I'd heard good things, so I was looking forward to it. The film is shot like a documentary created by Dean, a man that moves into a new house and finds Marcel, a 1-inch tall shell, living there with his grandmother. As the documentary progresses, we learn more about Marcel and his family, and how they disappeared after the house's previous tenants moved out. Now, it's not very often that A24 steps out of their comfort zone of low-budget indie horror flicks, but after experiencing this film, I wish they'd do it a lot more. What director Dean Fleischer-Camp managed to do with this film is something that films earlier on in this list, like Minions, failed to do. Create something incredibly accessible and engaging for children, while never questioning the intelligence of the viewer. This is a sweet story about an unconditionally endearing child making his way through the world and learning the lessons of life along the way. The film explores different topical issues like the pros and cons of sharing aspects of your life online, to dealing with the grief and loss of those close to you. It's quite remarkable how these themes are handled in such a simplistic and easy to digest way, but still remain poetically profound. It's a film that reminds us what's really worth valuing in modern society. It's so easy to get distracted these days with tall buildings, expensive cars, gym memberships, and our social media presence, but this movie encourages you to stop looking outward and to instead look inward. Now, the movie didn't affect me emotionally as much as I was expecting, mostly because people hype everything up way too much, but I can only gush at the message it intends to get across and how it goes about executing those ideas. We all get upset when we lose people, it's always sad, but it will always get better again. Life moves on. This is the lesson that both Marcel and Dean learn from each other. There's a poem in the movie by Philip Larkin called Trees that goes, "You can't enjoy the daffodil without honouring what has died so it can regrow." I think in short it's saying, try to live life for the love of living. Yes, it's gushy, but it's a message that I think we all need reminding of now and again. Marcel the Shell with Shoes On is a wonderfully animated, heartwarming story that you should definitely check out. The Menu is a film that I'd been looking forward to for a while before its release. The promotional material and trailer was pretty vague as to what the movie was actually about, so it manages to expertly prepare you for the mysterious intrigue without ever going overboard and showing too much. I had no idea what it was about, but I knew I wanted to see it anyway. After having watched it, I'd say that the film itself is a slow burn thriller that teeters on the edge of being a horror and a comedy without actually committing fully to either of them. This works wonderfully to the film's benefit, as the humour remains dry and witty without ever conflicting the tone, and while the events that take place over the night are pretty horrifying, they never go so far as to distract from the central themes. The film follows Margot, who gets dragged by her partner Tyler into travelling to a coastal island to eat at an exclusive restaurant where the chef has prepared a fancy menu and things slowly turn more sinister. The menu is many things: a satire of class and how wealth ultimately taints a person's values. It's a critique on critics themselves and how they risk very little but still manage to hold power over those that offer their own work for criticism, and a commentary on art and how monetizing it can inevitably leech the passion and desire to create from the artist. Obviously, the main focus of the film is food, but the messaging and subtext can easily be transposed to any other artistic expression. You could replace the setting of the restaurant and chefs with filmmakers, painters, musicians, whatever, and the central theme stays the same. It sparked a thought within me about my passion for art and what priority I give it in my life. I'd love to be a musician for a living, or even make videos like this, but I've always worried that once I'm expected to do it to a professional degree, the joy would slowly fade away. I'm sure it's not going to surprise anyone that's seen either of their work before, but Ralph Fiennes and Anya Taylor-Joy are pretty exceptional in this. Fiennes is incredibly intimidating in the role of Chef Slowik. He fills the room with dread and tension whenever he claps to introduce the next course. Yet later on into the runtime, he delivers a more subdued vulnerability that humanizes the character in a way that I didn't initially expect. Anya Taylor-Joy works as the audience surrogate and gives an effortlessly engaging performance that manages to be honest and engaging, but still funny when it's needed. I do think that a few of the side characters are a little undercooked in the writing department though, and others aren't given enough screen time to naturally develop over the course of the film. It would have been nice to get a little more out of these people, but I don't think it necessarily harms the film since its thematic resonance attempts to paint them in a two-dimensional light regardless. Overall, the menu is fun, quirky, captivating, entertaining, poignant, and definitely worth your time. I recommend it. Cha-Cha Real Smooth takes the award for most confusing title in relation to how it represents its movie. Literally, the song plays in one scene, and that's about it. But all that aside, this might be the movie that took me most by surprise in regard to its quality. I was expecting a typical rom-com type of movie, but it's so much more than that. This film is unflinchingly earnest in its portrayal of love and the resulting relationships surrounding it, but it remains sweet and tender through its charming characters. The movie is about a 22-year-old named Andrew who begins working as a party planner for bar and bat mitzvahs, where he becomes friends with a young mother and her teenage daughter who has autism. From here, he slowly becomes more entangled in their lives, and each of the characters begin to make an impact on each other. I'm not typically a massive fan of the romance subgenre of filmmaking, but this film in particular managed to accomplish something that very few of them do for me. It made me invested enough in these people so that I actually care what happens to them, which is something that Persuasion, also featuring Dakota Johnson, failed to do. I think this is accomplished mostly due to its natural dialogue and realistic portrayal of love. You expect with these kinds of movies that the happy couple will inevitably get together, or that they'll be tragically pulled apart for one reason or another, but few films have the maturity to let their characters go their separate ways in a mutually agreed decision. I think Andrew works well as a protagonist for the most part, but if I'm going to nitpick, I say that he is a little simplistic and borderline two-dimensional at times. He's a nice person, but he's such a nice person that it begins to feel a little unlikely at times. It doesn't trouble me all that much though, since this actually works as one of the film's strengths. The fact that Andrew himself lacks much depth actually makes room for all the other characters to fill that space, which it honestly does. You rarely get the impression that writer Cooper Raiff cares for each of these characters, including the ones that would usually be vilified. In these kinds of movies, the stepfather or the rival love interest are made out to be awful people, so that the protagonist becomes an underdog and you want them to succeed even more. But in Cha-Cha Real Smooth, each of these people are given their own time to shine and come across as genuine people trying to find their footing in the world. Between the plot's accurate depiction of how love manifests in the world and Andrew's unrelenting optimism, the movie sort of cushions you in a warm safety blanket and honestly inspires me to try to be a better person. The film is simultaneously a heartwarming and heartbreaking tale of innocence, naivety, and ultimately growing up. Whether we're an unnaturally mature 12-year-old or a 30-year-old party animal, we all have to grow up eventually. If I had a nickel every time Willem Dafoe got naked in a Robert Eggers movie, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Now usually, I'm not one for period pieces or the Viking aesthetic. I don't really have anything against it, but I find that the stories they tend to tell are often dime a dozen. When it comes down to it, I suppose that The Northman is just the story of Hamlet or The Lion King told in a new way, but this film is so viscerally raw and stylish that it didn't really bother me. The cinematography in this movie is fantastic, with visually striking, perfectly symmetrical camera shots on one takes that last minutes at a time. The whole thing is choreographed exceptionally well in the battle sequences, and acting from all the cast is pretty great. I was a little confused at first when Nicole Kidman showed up. I thought she didn't really fit naturally into the world, but I did grow to appreciate what she brought to the film as time went on. Everyone else is great though. Alexander Skarsgård, Anya Taylor-Joy, and Ethan Hawke particularly are the standouts. There was some pretty gnarly practical gore in here, which is always appreciated in these kinds of movies. However, I did notice a few shots towards the beginning where the blood spatters were quite obviously CG, which pulled me out of the story a little bit. I don't really have much to say about The Northman if I'm being honest, and I feel bad since it's so high on my list, but I just really liked it. Robert Eggers hasn't made a bad movie yet, and through all that, the biggest accomplishment he's made is having Alexander Skarsgård howl like a wolf several times without making him look like a fucking idiot. Good job, movie. Despite Spiderhead being way further down the list, Joseph Kosinski and Miles Teller are back with possibly the biggest movie of the year. This came out back in May and is still screening in a few cinemas in my area. When hype was building for this, I wasn't all that excited myself since I'd never seen the original film, but I did get around to watching it around a week before this came out, and now after having watched them both, I think this one is better. It's a legacy sequel done right. There are so many movies these days riding on the coattails of better films from the 70s and 80s that just miss the heart of the original. Top Gun Maverick does it perfectly. It's faithful to the original in tone, concept, and heart, but isn't rehashing the same idea. From the trailer, I was expecting another overly macho action flick, but was genuinely surprised by how tender it was. Despite over 30 years passing since the original, it never sacrifices the first film's emotional core. It would have been so easy to make it Tom Cruise Goes Whoosh in a Plane, the movie, but the choice to focus on Maverick's emotional journey after losing Goose is its greatest strength. The cast were all great in this, special nod to Miles Teller as always, and Hans Zimmer's score was everything it needed to be. It was rhythmic and upbeat during action sequences, and slow and sorrowful for the emotional scenes. The film is visually stunning and, let's be honest, a marvel of technological achievement for how they went around filming the thing. I'm sure that it will still be very enjoyable when it comes to streaming or if you buy it on Blu-ray, but this is definitely one of those films that you should see in the cinema. The visuals, the audio, everything is just incredible. If I had to think of a negative, and this is nitpicking, it would be that Jennifer Connelly's character wasn't really necessary for the story, and her whole part of the movie could have been cut to create a tighter, more focused film. Everything else was pretty fantastic. Definitely check this one out. The Black Phone is a weird one. I've seen lots of people talk about this one from a lot of different perspectives. Some people really like it, and others sort of cast it aside as just another horror movie. Obviously, I sit in the former camp because this film is great. It's certainly not your average Blumhouse movie, it's something far more than that. So the movie, based off the short story by Joe Hill, that's Stephen King's son, follows Finney, a young boy living in a quiet suburban area in the 1970s where kids have started to disappear. One day on his way home, Finney is kidnapped by a mysterious man known as the Grabber and locked in his basement containing nothing but a mattress, an old toilet, and a disconnected black phone. From here, Finney is obviously trying to escape, but things turn supernatural when the broken phone starts to ring and he hears voices of the Grabber's previous victims. So the first thing I want to say is, I love how they decided to spend the first 30 minutes or so exploring the average lives of these characters. I think a lot of movies would have had the kidnapping take place in the first 15 minutes, but the extended time we get to spend with Finney and his sister Gwen truly makes us care for them and ultimately root for their success. And boy, these child actors are phenomenal. The two main kids are very talented, and I look forward to seeing more of them in future movies. I can see that a lot of people will draw comparisons between The Black Phone and It, due to the surface level similarities, like being set several decades ago, mainly being a story about kids versus adults, and even visual nods like bike rides in empty streets and bright yellow raincoat in torrential weather, but I feel that The Black Phone is a far more mature movie than It. It's capable of showing restraint when it needs to, and doesn't always go for the most obvious scare. In fact, I'd say that this was the most tension I felt in a movie for a long time. There's a sequence where Finney is trying to escape and struggles with the combination to a bike lock, and it really did have my heart going. I say that this movie is more mature than you'd think, and I'd also add to that it treats its audience with a level of respect, and doesn't feel the need to spell everything out for you. I'm not usually the kind of person who tries to work out a movie's twist before the end, because, let's be honest, where's the fun in that? But here, I did manage to piece together the end reveal around halfway through the movie because of a small piece of set dressing in the background of one particular scene. It was satisfying to notice something that pointed towards the reveal myself, and for the movie not to tell us through a dramatic flashback or something. The film was a great experience, and I totally recommend you go watch it. Also, that was totally the song Time from the end of Inception at the end, right? I have a strong feeling that this is one of those love it or hate it movies, depending entirely on if you turn to movies for a bit of light entertainment or if you look for something a little more substantial from it. The story follows 11-year-old Sophie and her father Callum, who are on a holiday together in Turkey. The film sort of bounces back and forth between key moments of this holiday and how the pair's relationship evolves from it. Now, towards the end of the movie, it's revealed that Sophie is now a 30-something watching back memories that were recorded onto a camcorder, and she's reflecting on the last holiday that she and her dad had together. Normally, I wouldn't tell you this, but I think that you're way more likely to enjoy your time with Aftersun if you know from the beginning what exactly is going on. Because for a large section of the movie, it seems that nothing is really happening at all. You expect a plot-driving event to happen sooner or later, but it doesn't. It's just moments of the pair's holiday passing by at a rather relaxed pace. And this is why that I think a lot of people will find this boring. Nothing exciting or dramatic happens, it's just a sort of slice of life thing. The subtext that you pull from Aftersun is everything. For me, I thought that it's funny how we can be so oblivious in the defining moments of our lives, and only in hindsight come to terms with what we've actually missed. Because as the movie progresses, cracks slowly begin to form in the pair's relationship, and I found myself dreading the worst case scenario, with Callum leaving Sophie behind or possibly doing something drastic to himself. Now, while nothing that extreme actually happens by the film's climax, it did hammer home the whole point of the story. It encourages you to re-examine what you've already seen in closer detail. You see, as the film unfolds, it becomes clear that Callum is struggling with his emotions and is trying his absolute best to stay composed for the sake of his daughter. We don't know exactly what he's struggling with, my initial guess being depression and anxiety, though it's not really the point. Most of us were probably unaware of our parents' struggles when we were children, but Sophie, who's clearly very emotionally mature for her age, seems to know that something is up. Callum opens up at one point and mentions how when he was 11, everybody forgot about his birthday, and this one moment of vulnerability speaks volumes for his motivations as a father. He only wants to provide a better life for his child than he received himself, and while she may not have understood this at the time, she ends up revisiting these memories as an adult with a child of her own. What once came across as randomly disconnected scenes that were a tad boring now serve as memories that remind us it's the small things that matter. Throughout the film, we occasionally cut to the adult version of Sophie making her way across the room of what appears to be some sort of rave in order to reach her father, who has since become estranged. Aftersun never commits to clarifying its meaning, but I think that the dark room works as a representation of Callum's depression. As the film closes and he says goodbye to Sophie, we watch him turn around and retreat to that same room, as now that the holiday is over, he will regress to his negative mental state. Sophie's last memory of the trip to Turkey was her father dancing to Queen and David Bowie's Under Pressure, and is one of the few times that we see him completely happy. Maybe Sophie imagines the rave to bring herself comfort. Despite him succumbing to the darkness that constantly followed him, she chose to imagine him dancing to keep that small spark of light alive. This is simultaneously a heartbreaking and heartwarming story that sits with you for a long while after it finishes, but if you're expecting something exciting, this is not the one for you. And my favourite film of the year, The Banshees of Inisherin. Now, I know that this is an Irish film, but I had 4 different adverts for booze before this started. A bit stereotypical there, Showcase Cinema. Now, it's not very often that I experience a film that leaves me completely stunned as the credits roll. There aren't many films that leave me thematically satisfied, but simultaneously emotionally unsatisfied. The Banshees of Inisherin is one of those special movies. It's weird, but also oddly impressive how director Martin McDonagh managed to balance light-hearted humour with heavy themes of grief and toxicity in the same film. There are loads of funny moments in here, ranging from vocal deliveries to subtle body language, but they only seem to make the emotional sequences even more effective. The whole thing is incredibly well acted, especially by our 2 leads, Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson, which just drives that stake into your heart even further. What I witnessed with this film was a 2-hour exploration of how traits like pride, vision, and cynicism manage to isolate people and destroy the relationships that they have with those around them. They're characteristics that, in the right mind, can be used to positive effect, yet when misunderstood or misused, can lead to a slow descent into nihilism. So, Padraig and Colm are 2 friends on the Irish Isle of Inisherin who have a daily routine which involves going to the pub together at the same time every day. But one night, Padraig finds that Colm isn't home and finds him in the pub by himself. When he tries to speak to him, Colm asks him not to talk to him and says that he doesn't want to be friends anymore. Obviously a bit confused initially, Padraig asks what he's done to upset him, but Colm says nothing. He's just a bit dull. He'd rather dedicate his time to pursuing his musical endeavours and to leave something behind, rather than chat away about bollocks all the time. Now, I think that Colm is a character that becomes a lot more relatable if you are an artist, or someone that wants to create something for themselves. Maybe not to leave a legacy necessarily, but for their own sake of self-worth and productivity. I am one of these people. The thing that truly resonated with me here is that I have had these thoughts. I've wanted to do something creative with my time to the detriment of the relationships I forged with my peers. I've chosen to spend time creating art over speaking with my friends and family. The Banshees of Inisherin is a beautiful tale that portrays this thought process in depth and how it can lead to the worst possible scenarios for everybody. I do completely understand where Colm was coming from with his thought process, but his actions essentially ruined the lives of everyone around him. His cynicism corrupted his former friend into a hollow shell that once was filled with kindness, but now exists only as a spectre of guilt, bitterness, and regret. The movie asks the question, would you rather be remembered forever, or forgotten about but known as a nice person in life? We watch these people lose everything, and by the film's conclusion, Padraig has lost his friend, his sister, his confidant, his donkey, and his main identifying trait, his unwavering positivity. Colm has lost the respect of his neighbours, his priest, his house, the ability to play the violin, and the chance to reclaim his friendship. It's the most bleak and gut-wrenching way to end this film, and I absolutely love it. It's poetic, it's poignant, and my favourite film of the year so far. So that's it, every movie that I saw released this year ranked from worst to best. I hope you enjoyed the video. I've been working on it periodically for months and I'm glad to finally put it out. Obviously this is a deviation from my usual content, which focuses more on games than movies, but I would like to occasionally do some film stuff now and again. I also want to apologise for my voice in this one. I'm pretty sick right now and I'm all congested, so sorry I had to expose you all to that. If you'd like to keep up to date with my film endeavours and what I'm watching, then feel free to follow me over on Letterboxd, where I'm pretty active, way more so than I am here. There were some other movies that I wanted to watch but I didn't get around to because either I was limited on time or they weren't available for me to watch in the UK yet. But given the chance, I'd have also liked to include Babylon, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, She Said, The Fabelmans, The Whale, Women Talking, Tar, Triangle of Sadness, Jurassic World Dominion, RRR, Hustle, and Broker, to name a few. There's just not enough time in the world, man. But anyway, let me know what you thought of this video, subscribe if you want to see more, and I guess I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.